welcome. We are really excited to have you for the third conversation in our Reimagining Food Retail Conversation series. Most of you know me by now, but for those of you who don't, I'm Danielle Gould, founder of Food+Tech Connect and co-founder and co-CEO of Alpha Food Labs. Food+Tech Connect is a community for food innovation. We launched in 2010, and since then, we've built a network of over 46,000 entrepreneurs, investors, executives, farmers, chefs, professionals, and more in 32 countries around the globe. And you might know us for our bi-weekly newsletter and monthly events that help you track and make sense of the business, tech, and investment trends in food. You know, as we've already talked about throughout the beginning parts of the series, last year really shined a light on the cracks and disparities across our food system. While there's always been a moral imperative to do better, there's finally a financial one, which is creating this unique opportunity to fundamentally redesign our food system. And that's why we're excited to be embracing this new digital virtual format through these conversations and our newly launched Slack group, which many of you have joined. That create a space for interactive conversations where stakeholders from farm to fork can come together and convene to discuss how we might reimagine the business of food and agriculture to make them more resilient, equitable, delicious, diverse, healthful, and climate smart. And we're really grateful to S2G Ventures, who are partnering with us to host this inaugural 4-part series. Where we're exploring how we might reimagine food retail. If you don't know them already, S2G is one of the leading venture funds in food and agriculture, and they're very committed to supporting this community. This series was actually inspired by a report that they released last year entitled The Future of Food Through the Lens of Retail. And we're gonna put a link in the chat so you can download the report. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of today's program, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who's going to be moderating. So today we're going to spend about 40 minutes in moderated conversation, and then we're going to have 45 minutes of group Q&A, and we'll end with some breakouts. Our goal is to really make this a lively discussion. So the chat is your space. Feel free to pose questions of the participants, to share ideas, to respond to comments by speakers, share needs, offers, do whatever you like in this space. We would encourage you to start by introducing yourself and letting everyone know that what you're working on. We also have the Slack group, which you've been invited to, and that's a place for us to have ongoing discussions. We're going to put a link in the chat so you can join that group if you haven't done so yet. For today's Q&A, we're using a platform called Slido. So please go and enter your questions there. You're also able to upvote other people's questions, so you can let us know which you'd like to see asked. This is a way for us to collect questions, and we will be unmuting people to ask those questions live during the Q&A portion. So visit the link that we're going to put in the chat to submit your questions for review, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Finally, a note about etiquette. We want this to be a really safe space for discussion. And this is going to be a very emotional and provocative conversation. And we really want to encourage healthy debate, but expect that everyone will be kind, courteous, and respectful in their discourse. There's zero tolerance for hate speech or bullying, and anyone who engages in either will be removed immediately. If you're talking about your experience on social media, please be sure to use the hashtag Food+Tech or Food+Tech. And we'll also be sharing everyone's social handle in the chat. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Jessica Murphy, Business Development Manager at S2G Ventures, who is going to be leading this discussion. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks for bringing us all together today. So the pandemic of 2020 is shining the brightest of lights on our present day food system and exposing both its resiliency and vulnerabilities. No industry touches more aspects of our lives than food. We all participate in this community 3 times a day, every day. It employs 11% of our population and represents 10% of household expenditures. It underpins our social fabric and directly relates to the health of our communities and the planet. We are at a critical moment of time for the future of grocery and retail and brands, and I'm thrilled to welcome to today's discussion Errol Schweizer, Sam Polk, Gerardo, Reyes, Chavez, and Greg Asbed. here to the discussion today. What we are talking about today is very deep and expansive, as Danielle had noted. Before we dive into the heart of the discussion, I'd love to invite each of our guests to take a moment to introduce themselves and to share why they're passionate about the topic of reimagining grocery to better serve all stakeholders. Let's start with you, Errol.
Thanks, Jessica. I just want to send a shout out to my friends and long-term colleagues at S2G and appreciate you guys putting this program together. I've been in the food industry for about 25 years, started out in co-ops and CSAs, spent 14 years at Whole Foods Market, including 7 years responsible for the grocery division, which was the largest division, responsible for 30% of sales and profit dollars, worked with thousands of companies, helped start a whole bunch of food trends and really reignite plant-based and vegan foods, grass-fed. Spent a lot of time on fair labor, fair trade, and really helped establish organic and non-GMO as pretty mainstream everyday food trends. I left Whole Foods about 5 years ago, and I've been an advisor and board member for about 20 different companies in the organic and wellness-based space. I've also recently started a podcast called The Checkout to highlight the efforts of essential workers, food chain workers, in the current pandemic, in the current economy, where we have really frank, open conversations with folks on the front lines, folks doing research about food justice, food access, and related issues. I've also recently started a column on Forbes.com and want to appreciate Danielle and the Food+Tech folks for allowing me the opportunity to blog on their platform as well. Thank you.
Sam, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself.
Great. Hey, everybody. I'm Sam Polk. I'm the CEO of Everytable, and we are a company that's all about making fresh, healthy food affordable and accessible for everyone. And the sort of story of how we came to be is, very quickly is, my background was sort of on Wall Street, and I was a hedge fund trader that sort of had a crisis of conscience and decided to do something different and came back to LA, where I grew up, and ended up watching a bunch of Netflix food documentaries, one of which was Lori Silverbush's A Place at the Table, which talked about the intersection of food and poverty and how, so many neighborhoods don't have access to fresh, healthy food. And, partially as a consequence of that, a kid born in South Los Angeles will live 11 years less than a kid born in Bel Air. And for whatever reason, that was the thing that sort of got me, this idea that healthy food is a human right and shouldn't be a luxury product. And so first thing I did was started a nonprofit in South LA to sort of work on these issues, and was working with a lot of moms in South LA and came to understand that there was very real demand for fresh, healthy food, but just no supply. And so that got us sort of thinking about the answer to this question, like, why does a fast casual salad cost $16 and burgers and fries cost $6? And, there's a pretty sort of, interesting sort of simple answer to it as we sort of, dug into business models, although I'm super curious to hear what Errol has to say about this, because I think he knows way more about this than I do. But we basically came to understand that the biggest food companies in the country are CPG and fast food companies. And they're, in our opinion, sort of the biggest because they figured out how to sell food the cheapest. And the way they do that is this sort of model of centralized production and national distribution. And so I like to think about like the maker of Corn Pop cereal to have like a single factory making all these boxes with incredible efficiencies and economies of scale and automation, and then putting those boxes onto trucks and sending them all over the country where they sit on retailers' shelves. And the thing that makes all of that work, the efficiency of that system, is non-perishability. And so, in my opinion, sort of that's why 80% of a grocery store is these shelf-stable products. And so, and actually, not to get into it, but fast food is basically the same thing, where you think of like fast food as a restaurant, but it's the end of a national manufacturing supply chain of basically non-perishable products. And so Everytable, and then restaurants, not to get into it, but are basically the complete opposite, where there's no centralized production, no economies of scale. And the reason that they're structured like that is because they're fresh. And so what Everytable did is basically said, can we apply some of the learnings from CPG and fast food to fresh food so that you can make healthy food as affordable as, CPG and fast food. And the way we do it is, set up a central kitchen in every major region. We're in LA now and New York this year. And at that kitchen, we produce fresh, healthy, delicious meals every day and then package them in grab and go containers. And then we run our own cold chain logistics to, the myriad ways that we sell the food. So we have restaurants, which sort of look like a pret-a-manger, where they're, grab and go restaurants. And because we're not doing the cooking there, they're significantly less expensive to operate and build. And we also have smart fridges, which are basically like healthy vending machines, and an e-commerce subscription business, which drops, boxes of fresh meals on people's doorsteps. And because we have this, model of centralized production and direct distribution and high volumes, we're able to get fresh, healthy food to be more affordable for everybody. And, to end, what that means for us is that, affordability means different things in different neighborhoods. So when we sell food in Brentwood or, downtown LA, more affluent communities, we'll sell our meals for $7 or $8, which is, half the price of a fast casual salad. But we'll also open stores in underserved neighborhoods like Compton, South LA, and Watts, and sell those same meals for $5 or $6.
Great. And then Gerardo and Greg, if you could both introduce yourselves too.
I'll start. My name is Gerardo, and we are really excited to be participating in this conversation. The reason why this is exciting, or we were passionate, I don't really like the word passionate, but what I would say is, we got involved in this because there's a lot of suffering going on in the food chain. In the tomato industry, we have seen conditions of modern day slavery. There's 9 cases that have been prosecuted. The second case of modern day slavery is what brought me to participate in the coalition of Immokalee workers. When I met some of the workers who were part of this, they were bought and sold. So for me, the passion comes from, the idea of changing these realities. And that's why we started with the campaign for fair food. I think that business can be done in a way in which the humanity of those workers who are part of these industries don't have to be stepped on, don't have to be crushed in the form of extreme abuses. We have been able to change with the participation of some important brands, which we will talk about. But at the end, we think that this is a model, the Fair Food program, it's a model that can be applied in many different sectors with the participation of buyers. So I think that grocery, reimagining grocery for me, it's a passionate topic because it gives us the opportunity to dream beyond what we have been able to change up to today. So thank you for inviting me.
And my name is Greg Asbed, and I'm one of the co-founders of the CIW. And my work is involved in managing the functioning and the growth, the expansion of the Fair Food program. And we'll get into that, as Gerardo said, later on in the conversation. In terms of, sort of why we're involved in this, it's kind of the same reason as Gerardo explained. We live and work at the bottom of the nation's food supply chain. That's where we are all the time. I got to Immokalee 30 years ago. And when I got there, it was not uncommon to see people on payday getting beaten in public by their crew leaders because they complained about their pay not being straight, right? And I would have people come and talk to me about having gotten jumped on in the fields by crew leaders and their families for complaining about a bucket that wasn't full enough, and that sort of thing where people were cheated on their pay, experienced violence and sexual harassment and sexual assault. And even, as Gerardo said, modern day slavery was commonplace and remains commonplace in large parts of the food supply chain that ends in fields across this country. Now, the one place where that stuff doesn't happen anymore is in the Fair Food program that we've been able to build real market-backed protections to give workers power to monitor and enforce their own rights. But I will add that, both Gerardo and I don't just live in Immokalee and do that, but for years We work together in watermelon harvesting in states from Florida to Georgia to Missouri, and then on the East Coast, depending on the year, through North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. And so the work itself, we both know what it means, how hard it is, how hot it is, how dangerous it is, how easily it destroys your body over the years, and how, despite all of that, how underpaid, underprotected, harsh, brutal, and short life is as a farm worker. And so that anybody who I think we both believe very firmly that anybody who sees what we see and has experienced what we've been able to do every day that we go to work would do the same thing we're doing, which is dedicate their lives to trying to change the way that the food industry treats people at the bottom of the industry. It's long overdue.
Thank you both for, or all for sharing those details and giving our audience some context into who each of you are. As Gerardo and Greg had shared, there's a lot of suffering happening in the food supply chain. In fact, recent studies have found that food and agricultural workers are at the highest risk of death from COVID-19 among the working age Californians. In 2019, 22.2 million full and part-time jobs were related to the agriculture and food sectors, which makes up about 11% of total US employment. Food and agriculture is a significant contributor to US GDP. In context of today's discussion, I'd like for all of us to touch on the topic of labor and equity in the food system. So what common challenges do people have when it comes to labor in the food system, and what needs to be done to address them? What types of questions do we as an industry need to be asking? And what does the industry need to be talking about? Who's doing it right? Let's start with you, Gerardo and Greg. I know we just kind of briefly touched on the topic, so to go a little deeper on labor.
Well, for us, the challenges that we have as a community are many. You know, we started to fight. I got involved in 1999, and by then the coalition was in the transition between working to try to bring the growers to the table to eliminate the abusive conditions that were happening forever, and in transition to try to bring the market to participate in this. We you know, as a community, the challenges that we saw were that it didn't matter which actions we did. The coalition did 3 general strikes with more than 3,000 workers, a hunger strike by 6 workers for 30 days to draw attention to the conditions and then bring the growers, the entire industry to the table to work together and eliminate the abusive behavior and put a stop to all of these things. Stagnant wages were also part of the issue, and you know, sexual assault and sexual harassment going on for 90% of women, child labor. All of these issues brought us to basically try to see how we could change all of these conditions by bringing those who profit the most. When we started to follow the money, we realized that there was a huge influence and power from the retail food industry in the country that was using their influence to drive prices down. They would get high quality, they would get all the boxes that you need to check in when you are paying attention only to a product. And they were doing it very efficiently, growing their buying power, gave them the opportunity to do all of those things, but the need to stop all of these abuses was never an intention. So we started to invite corporations, started with Taco Bell. We had a campaign of boycott for 4 years. And then we started to invite others. Up to today, we have 14 agreements with corporations, including Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, even Walmart is participating on this, and they help us to expand these protections. As workers, you know, this has given us the opportunity to be able to stop all of these abuses. It's not that they don't continue to happen, but whenever they happen, there is a resolution process. Workers are protected to speak up freely about what's going on, and that's not the case outside of the Fair Food Program. The Fair Food Program contains legally binding agreements between workers, growers, and the retailers, food retailers that have signed on to it. But it also has the not the workers as a subject matter, but the workers at the center, driving the whole process of implementation of the program by uh, having the power protecting them to use the system. And then audits take place. All of this is part of the solution. But outside of the program, we still see people taking advantage of workers in really violent ways, taking the money, forcing them to sleep inside buses. We were investigating something that was going on to workers on H2A in Georgia, in a case very, very violent, that workers were reporting. All of those are the challenges that we see today. And what we need to address is the fact that, especially in times of COVID, we continue to live in a really vulnerable position. We are transported in overcrowded buses. We live in overcrowded housing. Our community is deemed essential, but the protections and provisions that should be given to them have never really been part of any serious conversation. So we have to deal with that through the partnership that we have established with 90% of the tomato industry. We created protocols, but as I said, this doesn't exist anywhere else. So the challenge for us is how can we work with people that can help to expand this? And that's why this conversation makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Actually, I quote Errol Schweizer, who has been a longtime supporter of ours. He wrote Fast Food Nation, he's a well-known, brilliant thinker. And he was talking about the question that you just asked about the exploitation and abuse at the bottom of the food system, and how do you fix it? And he said words to the effect of, there are a lot of terrible, intractable problems in this country today that it seems impossible to solve, but this isn't one of them. We can actually fix this. We can solve it. And in fact, when he said that, we hadn't actually launched the Fair Food Program yet, but the Fair Food Program is proof of his concept that it is solvable. But one of the best ways to understand it is by analogy. And I'm sure there are a lot of people on this, watching this today, who are maybe veterans of the process of trying to deal with food safety issues in produce, right? Because 10, 15, 20 years ago, salmonella, there was just constant news of really bad food illness outbreaks happening across the country. And growers had none of the protocols they have today in place. And they resisted it pretty hard, because that's kind of the way farmers can be, is they can be resistant to change. And probably for good reason, but whatever the case may be, you can't have food you're selling to the public that kills people, especially children. So what the industry had a problem, an existential problem. They had to fix it, right? And what did they do? They used what's called the power of the purchasing order. And they told their suppliers, if you don't get certified by X, Y, or Z certification program as food safety compliant, we won't buy from you. That's simple. And what happened? When you start talking about we won't buy from you, the minds of people at the bottom of the supply chain suddenly concentrate and suddenly awaken and realize we have to do this. And then once they start doing it, they realize it's not so hard to do this. And actually, we're a better operation today because we're doing it. And that exact process is what took place through the Fair Food Program. We got enough buyers to say, we won't buy from you unless you are certified compliant with the Fair Food Code of Conduct. And farmers resisted it. They resisted it. But after they started to do it, they realized this isn't so hard. And we have access to these companies, and we get a little bit more pay for our workers. And to be honest, we're better operations at the end of it all. So there is a solution, but it flows from the top. It's one that has to address that imbalance of power at the bottom of the supply chain. And it's the market power of the buyers at the top that has to be harnessed to drive that change.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like that's a really nice parallel into Sam and what he's doing on the other side of the supply chain for consumer demand, and would love to hear your perspective on labor, Sam.
Yeah, first of all, it's great to hear some of those thoughts that were just shared, which we're in agreement around. And so the way that Everytable sort of looks at it is sort of around ownership. And our sort of the core sort of ideology sort of behind our company is pushing against structural inequality in the world. And so when we started looking basically at the franchise model, we came to understand what a lot of sort of big food companies have learned, which is that franchising is a great way to sort of grow and expand your footprint. But the problem with it is that, like so many other industries, banking, law, Hollywood, et cetera, it's basically, for those who have capital and who have networks. And so, our sort of view, that comes from, our work in a lot of these communities is that, talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so what we've basically done for our franchising model, we call it the social equity franchise model, is we go to major foundations like, Kellogg and Kroger and, Annenberg and California Wellness and Dignity Health, and basically get philanthropic capital so that when we find talented entrepreneurs from historically marginalized communities, we can train them in store, train them through our sort of unique training program called Everytable University. And when they're ready, lend them the money that we've been lent by these foundations so that they can own their own Everytable franchise. And for us, that is like, we sort of think about pushing against inequality through the access and affordability of our food. But for us, this is sort of like, the capstone in terms of, true ownership. And we really look at, the possibilities here of people, owning, one franchise or two franchises or 10, and all of a sudden you're talking about real businesses and real wealth sort of being created for folks that, have incredible talent and grit, and just not sort of the access to capital that, certain sort of groups have a little bit easier time with.
So thanks, Sam. Errol, would love your perspective on how grocery retailers and brands can help address the labor equation. And can you speak more about ways in which grocers and retailers can lead when it comes to addressing both the product curation and the category management, which will ultimately, drive consumer demand to help both those issues that were covered by?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I mean, the buck stops with retailers, folks. Let's look at the numbers here. 85,000 meat processing, produce workers infected with COVID, hundreds dead. As far as we can tell, about 23,000 grocery workers in retail, once again, hundreds dead. At least 20,000 Amazon employees as well. And just here locally in Austin, Houston area, 350 grocery employees are currently suffering from COVID. My parents caught it in the early stages. They live in the Central Bronx, and I was on the phone with them daily, with just helping them manage. The food industry is essentially a super spreader event during COVID, and really the buck stops with retail. It starts with the folks who can generate purchase orders, as Greg said. And we all have goals here. Like, we all know, if you're a buyer, if you're a category manager, if you're in operations, you have financial goals. You have to make your numbers. You have expectations. Well, what about the qualitative goals too? What if one of your goals in category management was, you don't have to fuck people over to survive. You don't have to create suffering and misery in your supply chain in order to make a living. I mean, let's look at the other side of this thing, folks. We created a $50 billion organic food market in less than 20 years. We did that. We did that together. We did that with the consumers. We did that with farmers and growers. We created a $50+ billion non-GMO supply chain in a decade. In a decade, folks. We can do these things, right? What if we made a commitment as retailers, as product managers, as supply chain folks, to make sure that everybody in our supply chain was treated fairly and equitably, did not have to suffer or be exploited, weren't subjected to predatory and extractive practices on a day-to-day basis, weren't subject to the most dangerous and deadly working conditions in the world. I'm not even going to talk about the developed versus undeveloped world. When you have food chain workers who are literally the most vulnerable to COVID, back of the house restaurant workers, grocery clerks, the food industry is the epicenter of this here. And, I'm reaching out to, folks here as peers, colleagues. I'm in it day to day like you guys are. My wife is a frontline healthcare worker, so we see that day to day. we need to do this. We need to start from a place of everybody in the supply chain deserves what we think we need to in terms of being treated fairly, having health benefits. I mean, let's talk about hazard pay, paid sick leave. Let's get out of our comfort zones in terms of talking to worker representatives, particularly trade unions and collective bargaining agreements. We have to think about what is best for the folks on the other end of that purchase order. There is an act coming through Congress now called the PRO Act that you may want to think about. This would be the best worker protections in this country in decades in terms of allowing folks to unionize. Amazon is going through a unionization campaign in Bessemer, Alabama, and they're putting millions into stopping a group of mostly Black workers from Alabama who are working with the union that grew up out of organizing chicken plant workers, mostly Black people and primarily women in the Southeast. If that is not a miracle of modern economics, I don't know what is. So do you have their back, or are you a little hesitant because, you know, unions may make you uncomfortable? You know, your boss may raise their eyebrows because you're supporting somebody that is taking that initiative to actually change the conditions that they face on a day-to-day basis. So we need to think about what a solidarity economy looks like in the food system. We need to think about how we can embrace care in the food system and not just empathy. You know, because I think everybody here is empathetic. I think everybody here has a sense that things are not right. But how do we actually implement that? And I'll talk about values-based procurement in a little bit, but I just wanted to plant the seed there that when you have the power of the purchase order and you have those quantitative goals to meet, you have so much opportunity to actually influence folks. And you've done it. We've done it for decades now, but we've left out one of the most crucial parts of this, which is labor and social justice. It is anathema. And when you're looking at whether it's farm workers who are left out of the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1930s, also known as the Wagner Act, they don't have full protections that the rest of us have. When you look at the trucking industry, and every time that you rush a PO, or you want to combine loads and cross stock, what is that doing to on the road truckers? When you talk about what is going on in fulfillment warehouses, a friend of mine who's actually on the call, Megan Perkins, we've been talking about creating a checklist for co-packers. How do you actually create an ethical co-packer relationship, especially when you're a smaller brand and you're at the bottom of the food chain there? Well, maybe we should get together and start thinking about that too. And I'll speak in a moment about the Center for Good Food Purchasing, values-based purchasing framework, because they have actually created probably the most effective way of doing that at scale. At this point, they've got over $500 million in purchases going through this program, but it's primarily in the public sector. So why not the private sector too?
Thanks, Errol. So you teed that up perfectly. Would love to just dive right in and talk more about embracing and implementing social change. So can you each tell us about actions you are taking today to build a more transparent, equitable, diverse, healthful, and sustainable food system, and why this is important? For the sake of having the discussion flow, would love to go from farm to retail to food service. So Greg and Gerardo, if you could start, and then we'll go to Errol and then Sam.
Yeah, let me actually, something Errol said really hit a core. So many people on this call, on this panel, and then listening to this discussion, are somehow connected to the food industry. Some people in decision-making positions, and Gerardo and I have spoken to thousands and thousands of people in those positions, right? And what we do often is ask them to do a thought experiment with us, just for a second, right? And it goes to this question of the difference between empathy and solidarity, right? Errol talks about a solidarity economy, and he said everybody's empathetic, right? And that's true. But this thought experiment gets to the bottom of that, right? So say you're driving in the countryside and you're out, it's summertime, and you're driving through fields and you see all this wonderful produce, and my mouth is watering as I'm saying this, and you come upon a little farm stand, right? One of those beautiful summertime farm stands. It's a local farm, and you love local food, you love organic food, you eat it fresh. So you get out, you drive, you can hear your wheels on the gravel as you park, and you just see these rows and rows of incredibly beautiful, colorful, great fresh food. And you grab some bags, you fill up everything you can carry, and you go to the cash register. And the person there is a nice little person from the area, from the farm, and they're ringing up your food, and you're just happy as can be, because you know the rest of your ride, you're going to have this great stuff to eat. Wherever you're going, you're going to have it to share. And as the person is ringing up your food, you look over, you see the fields behind the register, and suddenly you hear a scream, like a horrible blood-curdling scream. And you look to the edge of the field, the far edge of the field, and you see a truck, a pickup truck where the scream's coming from. And you see a person being assaulted by her boss in the back of that truck, screaming for help. And just as you hear that scream and your food is being checked through, the person says, "That'll be $27.95, cash or check." What do you do? In this thought experiment, what do you as an individual person do? Do you reach into your pocket, grab your money, give your money over and take your bag and go away? Happy that you have this wonderful tasting food that looks just absolutely delicious? No. Frankly, no. I've asked that question to thousands of people and no one has said, yes, that's what I would do in that case. Seeing an assault take place in the fields where I'm buying food from, I would turn around and buy that food and walk away. No. And yet, in the food industry, when we collectivize that decision, which we do through corporations, when we collectivize that procurement decision, that's exactly what happens all day long, every day. Because, for example, our food industry is buying more than half of its produce these days from Mexico. And every single human being I've talked to in the food industry knows exactly what's going on in Mexico, in the fields. They've read the LA Times expose there. They know the reality. They know that there's no way that a single human being who works in the fields could possibly defend themselves against a boss, because they might get killed if they open their mouths about pay or about sexual assault or about human trafficking. And so that's the reality, is that somehow, and through corporate collectivized thinking, we're able to buy that food from a farm that we know that those human rights abuses are going on in every day. And that has to stop. So empathy is there, and we have to tap into that empathy and translate it into solidarity. We have to make it happen in a way that corporations collectively make the right decision about buying food from places where human rights are being respected. Now, unfortunately, for that to happen, you can't just ask. You can't just say, hey, you really should think about the fact that in Mexico, for example, there's zero controls and zero protections for workers. And there are documented abuses that go on that would curdle your guts listening to them. You can't do that. Nobody will answer, okay, you're right. We'll stop doing business as usual. We'll start doing business in a more ethical way. We have asked those questions and we have found that doesn't work, right? What you have to do is campaign. What you have to do is push. And so the one thing we have found is that there are, in the market, the market doesn't end at the level of the corporation. Most people believe and think that way and act that way. But in fact, the market ends at the level of the consumer. And usually consumers act in a very atomized way and don't collectivize their power. But when consumers act together, they're more powerful than the corporations that sell them food. So what we did was build common cause between workers and consumers to demand that these corporations stop buying from that roadside food stand in those conditions and start demanding humane conditions. So that's an answer to the question. That's what you have to do. We have to, unfortunately, pressure these corporations to change the way they've done business for decades. And if it were as simple as asking them to do differently, it would have happened a long time ago. If it were as simple as them fixing the problem through internal codes of conduct and monitoring, it would have happened decades ago. But all those things are in place, all those things have been tried, and the problems are still there. So it takes some kind of pressure, concerted action, in order to get these companies to change. And I wish it weren't that way, but it is.
And I would add, in regards to who we are within all of this, I feel that we are basically not affected in the way that we should be in general, because our humanity seems to be less valuable. Society doesn't see farm workers as important. Politicians don't see us as important. That's why we see, all the things going on right now with this health crisis. And to a certain degree, I think that it's been very easy for many businesses to disassociate themselves, being afraid, shy, I don't know, but reluctant to come to understand solutions like the Fair Food program. So I would say, something that we are doing is apply measures that come with the Fair Food Program to guarantee not just the identification and resolution of problems, but also the elimination of those problems, the prevention, which is the gold standard for any system to be able to prove its effectiveness. We have it. It was created here by workers themselves in a context of 90% of the workforce being men. We created one of the most powerful tools to be able to eliminate sexual assault, and it's working. Now, why is that, and what is needed? I would say what we need is people to understand this without being, without limiting your openness, to try to see how things like this can be applied in the businesses. It's time to marry business and human rights. And what we have has been proven by 14 other corporations, has been proven by 90% of an industry that has production in 7 states, in Florida up north, in the East Coast, and in some other states, in other countries even. So I think that we have an opportunity here, but I think that we need to, in general, wherever we are coming from to this conversation, we need to start recognizing the value of the humanity of the workers, because at the end, that's what we are trying to protect here. And the system we created is designed to make sure that the dignity of these workers is not stepped on, and that business go on, in a successful way. For us, we're not against progress. We're not against success. We're not activists that are gonna organize and just for the sake of, raising awareness about the issues. We're gonna do it if we have to. But what we really want is to have the opportunity to sit at the table with whomever has the ability to affect change. So this is an open invitation on our end, and I would say that's what we would like to see. We need to expand it.
Errol, I know you had briefly touched on values-based procurement in some of your earlier discussion points, but how do you think of values-based procurement as an actionable solution for the supply chain?
Yeah, it essentially creates a purchasing scheme that builds on the work that Coalition of Immokalee workers and other worker-driven initiatives have done. And I just want to distinguish between an initiative that is, driven by workers on the ground, such as CIW or Migrant Justice in Vermont, versus a multi-stakeholder initiative like a Fair Trade or a Rainforest Alliance, which is usually driven by professional NGOs and MBAs and folks who use an audit and certification process that tends to be a step or two removed from reality and from on the ground, what actually folks are dealing with. So this is a framework that actually puts workers and folks on the front lines at, with the seat at the table, like to actually give them a say in what happens next. So values-based purchasing is a public sector application of what, honestly, a lot of private sector retailers, like Good Eggs or natural grocers, or even the Whole Foods quality standards have tried to do relative to a number of different qualifications on ingredients and sourcing parameters and quality standards, and non-GMO and organic and whole food ingredients, et cetera, except they look at it in a different prism. So local is a big deal. So local and regional sourcing, nutrient density of foods, like actually looking at not just filling calories, the whole hunger argument led by, big food, conventional agriculture to feed the world is just garbage. We need to give folks good food, right? And there's plenty of it to go around. They have a framework on farm labor and supply chain labor, which is very relevant to what we're talking about. There's conversations about environmental effects, and then obviously animal welfare too. And what this does, it creates a quantitative scheme where you're encouraged to have continuous improvement in your purchasing standards throughout your supply chain, right? And so that way you're not looking at the folks at the bottom of the supply chain is essentially sacrificial workers to make things happen, but they are important stakeholders And I think the word that Greg and Gerardo has used is rights holders in your supply chain, that folks have rights, like they should be protected by the contracts, the purchase orders that you are actually, creating in order to supply your customers, right? And so at this point, like 14 cities and about 80 different institutions have adopted a values-based purchasing. I was on the Austin cohort with GFPP that has helped get the Austin Independent School District on that. And LA, San Francisco, Twin Cities, Boston, a number of other really big cities are looking at it for public institutions as a way of making sure they're buying more nutrient-dense foods. They're sourcing from local growers, like here in Austin. They're sourcing from like local grass-fed beef and local organic produce, grown in fair labor conditions, et cetera. And so, my take is like, why can't we just reapply that back to private sector? It was essentially influenced by the work that folks like us did for these last 20 years, but we may have left out a couple of details. And what they've done by partnering with trade unions, with partnering with public officials, community groups, community activists, food policy managers, like a number of cities now have food policy managers looking at this type of work. They've created this framework that I think is really applicable to what folks here on this call can and should do, because you can create goals around it. You can incorporate it into your business model. This doesn't mean that you're just going off the deep end, that there's a continuous improvement piece. And at the root of it, that you're creating a supply chain that is non-predatory, non-extractive, and that takes into account the well-being of everybody who's involved with getting food to your customers.
Yeah, I mean, just to say something about that, which I really agree with, like for us, I remember when we were starting Everytable, I sort of happened to get a chance to meet Yvonne Chenard from Patagonia, who sort of hammered in this idea of sort of taking full responsibility for your supply chain. And, for us, when we were starting, it was difficult insofar as, we had sort of like competing stakeholders on some level. One is that we needed to make sure that we can make meals, profitably at a $6 price point to sell in underserved neighborhoods. And at the other side, we basically had, this idea of sort of a supply chain that we could be proud of. And so for us, it has been sort of a journey that has to do with scale. And so as we start to reach scale, and for us, that's, we're going to, in the neighborhood of 35 restaurants in Los Angeles this year. And the ultimate vision for Everytable is, basically like, 400 plus restaurants in Southern California, 10,000 smart fridges, 100,000 e-commerce customers, like basically like a $300+ million business in Los Angeles alone, and then replicating that in basically all markets. And so what that then gives us the ability to do is go directly now, instead of, when we started, it was through distributors, et cetera. And now as we sort of, get the infrastructure for scale, we can go to local and regenerative farms and basically try to make arrangements with them that are mutual on some level. And so for us, what that means is like, we're always going to care about quality and we're always going to care about price. But Everytable has this really interesting advantage versus some of the more fast casual people, in that we make composed meals. And so we really can, on some level, do this sort of farm to table structure where we go to farms and say, listen, we want to take everything that you're growing, whether, you tell us what you're growing, including cover crops if they're edible, and we can take all of that and build our menus around it. And I think what we're trying to effect is this situation where the growers then have this sort of assured market of where they're going to sell to, and the ability for us to, hopefully take everything that they're growing. And for us, in that sort of holistic sort of partnership, being able to sort of, because we're potentially taking 100% of their yield, or then we can keep prices low, and also cut out these many middlemen that are often between sort of a food company and where the produce comes. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it.
Hey, Jessica, let me just jump in with one other thing that Greg kind of inspired that I wanted to mention, is that cheap is not good. Cheap is not good in food. I think the notion of the fact that we're going to increase food access purely by lowering prices is actually a complete fallacy. There's actually some studies that I've been reading recently about how actually increasing food prices are better for improving food access, because they decrease poverty. because folks could then get paid more, especially in the supply chain. There's other studies showing that if you increase farm worker wages and overtime for farm workers, has a negligible effect on the farm gate and therefore consumer price of food. Obviously, other factors involved, in terms of, the fact that a living wage, if we had kept pace with productivity, would be $25 an hour. We need to re-examine what our cost equation is for how we actually decide to sell product. But I just wanted to say that cheap is not good. And the more that you're focusing, especially as a retail or product buyer, on cheap, the more folks you're screwing over in the supply chain. And I think that, to me, that's an absolute at this point. And there are ways to pull costs out of the supply chain, I think, as Sam has just mentioned, in terms of, brokerage, middlemen, and, streamlining distribution, going local, combining contracts. I mean, but that's your job. If you're in purchasing, that's your job. You're supposed to be figuring that stuff out every day. The point is, though, is to adopt a paradigm that treats everybody in the supply chain with fairness and respect and takes into account their well-being, and that you're making sure that your supply chain is not creating more of the conditions of which this food system has been exposed now. And, it's been, 160, 170 years since plantation slavery was outlawed. It's been 530 years since, Columbus first came to the New World, right? But how far have we really moved past plantation slavery, indigenous genocide, land theft, dispossession, when we have a system in this country where we have hundreds of thousands of food chain workers that are suffering or have died? And the folks that are at the table that can make the biggest difference are the types of people here on this call. And think about what you can be doing, because this is the first crisis of the 21st century in the food system. This isn't the last. And we all are seeing what climate change is starting to do. We're all, this is the first time an infectious disease has had this effect. There will be more coming. And the folks that are going to pay for it are the folks, the farm workers in the Central Valley or in the Philippines or in West Africa, who continually pay the price for cheap food in this country. And that has got to stop.
I mean, I think the thing,
I'm sorry.
well,
Go ahead.
the one thing I wanted to say, so I agree with, nearly everything sort of that Errol, the point that Errol made. I think the thing for us is, like, when you look at, underserved neighborhoods, and, I'm talking South LA, Compton, Watts, these are neighborhoods with per capita income below $20,000. And, there are, tons and tons of fast food restaurants, and literally zero sort of fresh restaurants, basically. And this is in communities, if you think about it, where people are, more strapped for time, often working 2-3 jobs, etc. And so for us, like, one of our sort of key sort of internal company values is this thing we call transcend the friction, which is basically that for everything that we're doing, there are competing values. Like, we need to make food that is incredibly high quality, and we need to make it inexpensive, and we need to make it super healthy, but we also need to make it delicious and craveable. And I think that, for what we wanted to do was see if we could solve it all. And if we could create a system that did take responsibility for supply chain, but also didn't leave out the people who, frankly, are begging for, fresh, healthy food. And, one of the things that's 100% clear to me is that people in underserved communities don't love burgers and fries. They love $6 meals that they don't have to cook often, and, can you create a system that takes care of all of this? And our bet is that you can.
Right. And I would just add, one thing that Errol said that's important is that you can improve the lives of people at the bottom of the supply chain immensely by paying a slightly higher price at the farm gate. It will not get translated into any kind of meaningful bump at the end to the consumer. And the studies have been done. Again, there's a study out of California by Philip Davis that showed that you could raise farm worker wages across the board 40 or 50%, and it would cost the average family yearly budget the cost of 2 matinee movie tickets, $16 for the year, right? So I don't think any change that we're talking about in terms of really improving people's lives at the bottom of the food system is going to create, an unreachable food price at the end of the thing. I think it's hugely important that people be able to afford food, and good food. So I agree there. But I will say that when people who are in the purchasing divisions of these major corporations make price their North Star, right? That leads them to Mexico. That leads them to the lowest price producers, right? And what happens? What does that do in terms of the people in this country, for example, or people in whatever country that are trying to improve conditions for their workers, that are trying to invest in better pay and better conditions for farm workers on their farms? Does it encourage that? No. It creates a race to the bottom. So when you are driving that race from the top with your purchasing, which is based on price, you leave everybody who's trying to improve conditions on the margins. And they won't stay there for long. They'll follow what the market's telling them. They'll do what the market says it wants, because that's the power the market has. And so even these efforts at making things better will dry up as long as price is the only thing that really matters to people who are making the decisions about buying produce.
Thank you all so much. It's been a great discussion. I know we still had a number of other questions to cover, but would really like to turn it over to the audience. I know they have a lot of questions in the chat on similar topics to what we're discussing right now. So Danielle, hoping we could start to engage with everyone who's here today. And thank you guys again for your time.
Yes. All right, thanks so much. We're excited to move into the Q&A. If you haven't added your question yet to Slido or want to go and check out what other people are asking, please make sure to head over there. And we are going to start with our first question from, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your name, but I think it's Chhavi.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chhavi from Future Food Institute based in Italy. I'm the design lead at this ecosystem, and I just wanted to open it up for discussion. As a young innovator, we've been working with companies and their R&D departments to develop new sustainable products. And a lot of our work is focused on product development. And we're not really asked the questions about supply chain and procurement and how can we influence those decisions while coming from an R&D and product development side.
Yeah, I could handle that because I'm in that world quite a bit with product development. And I think it's just about asking questions. And it's obviously with you as a resource or consultant, you may not have control over it, but I think at least factoring it into your price build of, what are folks who are, picking, harvesting, transporting, distributing, everything along the supply chain, how are they being treated? You're most likely not going to get good answers about that now. And I think, especially if you're looking at imported products, you've got to take into account, international trade laws, which, actually, they benefit, they favor, corporations as opposed to workers. You can start thinking about some of the more effective multi-stakeholder programs in the world, like Naturland, which works closely with a number of farmers in Europe, and is actually farmer owned. There's some programs here in the US, if you're developing products besides CIW Fair Food Program, there's Agricultural Justice Project to help actually do that build and start examining what all those different layers of costs are. But that's my point. I think that's Greg's point too, is it technically shouldn't add too much, but it's a question of how you prioritize it and how you actually formulate that to make sure that, are you doing the right things and where are those potential vulnerabilities? Because the other side of that is that every single, one of these activist kids, and I'm raising two of them now, and they're both in their teens, their smartphone, internet, and just one day, if you make one mistake, you'll get exposed, right? There's so much hypocrisy. There's so much greenwashing in supply chains. Start doing things right, because at the other side of that is, folks are going to show up and say, hey, you know what? You're full of shit and you weren't doing what you told us you were going to do. So do it right from the start.
Great. Thanks so much. Did anyone else have anything to add to that? All right. So next we have Mike Lee. And Mike is going to ask a little bit about GameStop, but I wanted to highlight something that Alfredo asked just to kind of also tee up and add to Mike's question. So Alfredo asks around, do you think, this is a question for Errol, do you think that ESG and the activist corporate shareholders movement can be a way to reform business practices at Big Food, or is it just hype? So be sure to be able to address that in addition to Mike's question. Take it away, Mike.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this. I wanted to kind of spotlight, what happened last week with GameStop, and essentially I see it as kind of two motives. One was obviously there was a mass of individuals looking for kind of personal profit, but I think the bigger theme was that they all kind of banded together to sort of send a message and a statement to kind of large institutions. In this case, it was a hedge fund. I'm wondering if, seeing that as blueprint, is that a blueprint for something that we can learn from when it comes to food, social justice issues and things like that? How can we kind of learn from what happened there and apply it to some of the causes that we've been talking about here on this call?
I could take a quick cut at that. I'm certainly no expert on Wall Street, but I will say that I did just read this morning that the biggest benefit accrued to a hedge fund who got $700 million from the whole GameStop escapade. So whatever the intention of some of the people was, and it was real, on the part of some of the retail investors, they didn't have control over it fully. And it was, and now there's a lot of those retail investors that came in sort of middle of the game. They lost a lot of money, right? So it had an impact. It's interesting how it could be unpacked forever, right? But in terms of the broader question, like, is Wall Street, is there anything in Wall Street that could actually help change this? I think the answer should be yes. I think the ESG movement there should, because if you read its rhetoric, it is there. It's saying that we will invest in companies that do the right thing, to boil it down, right? And the problem is in almost exactly what's wrong with CSR, with corporate social responsibility, from the corporations themselves. There's stated values and there's actual practice, right? There's standards and then there's enforcement. And standards without enforcement are a lie. I teach a human rights class in a high school where my son goes, and I have told the kids at the end, by the end of this class, you have to choose to have either, you have to find somewhere that you're going to tattoo that sentence on your body, that standards without enforcement are a lie. And that's what ESG is at this point. I hate to say it because we have a lot of friends in that world, right? But until companies start actually divesting from companies that are proven to be not doing the right thing, then those companies know that any signal they're giving them, it is just noise, right? Those companies know that the companies that are not doing the right thing are not stupid. They listen to their investors. And if their investors say, we're really upset that you're not doing the right thing, but don't move their money, what's that mean to that company? Nothing. And that's what's happened as a result of ESG thus far, except maybe in the environmental sector. But in terms of human rights and labor, that's what it's meant so far. So I think it should be able to move mountains, frankly, because there are union pension funds and others that are just absolutely massive amounts of money of people and based on values that should support labor and stop human rights violations, right? But they've yet to really mobilize that money because of this thing called their fiduciary responsibility, which actually hamstrings everything they're doing. And I think they're probably looking at it all wrong. But then again, I'm not an expert in fiduciary responsibility. But I think if people start to redefine, what profit means and what benefits can accrue to some of these companies when they do the right thing, then even the fiduciary responsibility might fall in place. But so it's a long-term goal that happens. And it's great that it's starting to happen, that the sector is starting to grow, but it's a long distance between now and actually causing change at the end of these supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
Craig, this makes me think of a point you had brought up when we were having a conversation the other day on how we're holding on to these exposed and bankrupt systems and just how the models haven't quite caught up to, where we need to be at as we're thinking ahead and what this future system looks like.
I'll just add like a quick 10 seconds here is where they've been for the last year. Where has this ESG movement been? And I've read some interesting things about it, but how many of them have divested from Tyson or JBS or Smithfield? How many have put pressure on Kroger? Especially with the recent COVID outbreaks, or Kroger just closed 2 stores in Black and Latin American neighborhoods in Long Beach because they didn't want to pay hazard pay. I'm just saying that like folks are out to lunch. And I personally, having probably worked more closely with more big companies than almost anybody on this call, they respond to pressure. They respond to compulsion. I actually think anything voluntary like that is bullshit. And shareholder groups will have to put pressure on them. Consumer groups will have to put pressure on them. But ultimately, I'll quote Abe Lincoln again here is, labor is the superior of capital. Labor comes before capital. That the folks working in the supply chain really have to have the priority here, and I think are really going to call the shots.
Errol, can you get more tactical? What does that pressure need to look like?
Well, when COVID-19 outbreak first started, there were wildcat strikes all throughout the meat industry, which didn't get a lot of airplay. I started paying attention. I was like, oh, folks are like really panicking. And those folks in the meat plants in the upper Midwest and the deep South, they knew what was coming, right? And now when you look at the statistics that like Leah Douglas, from Fern publishes on a weekly basis of how many thousands. So, I think direct worker response, control, organizing, folks need to have a seat at the table. Once again, support the PRO Act, support worker-driven social responsibility. You as a buyer can influence that by looking at what those companies are actually doing and how they're treating folks and whether or not they're actually doing this. And it's not just about fair trade, which is very much been driven by big companies in the last decade. It's not about corporate social responsibility because there's once again no enforcement mechanism. There's no enforcement mechanism. So I really think it's about centering essential workers. The folks who have been closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. I think that's where we need to transition with these things. And I've got no beef per se with ESG. I'm very skeptical that folks are going to do it on their own. I mean, how many folks from the Business Roundtable for Responsible Corporations were highlighted in that Brookings Institute report that I cited in my article in terms of the extreme profit taking by big corporations during COVID-19, right? I'm saying, so ESG, I think you need to have pressure. And I think that pressure starts with the folks who are working in the facilities, working in the supply chain.
Does anyone else have
I'm going to
any
disagree
thoughts?
with the statement about car companies and moving to electric because I think Tesla is a very problematic employer. And he's a renowned union buster and particularly moves his facilities to right to work states. So I salute what he's done to put more electric cars on the road, but I think Elon Musk and his own worker policies have a lot to be desired.
I will say his model for how they approached the electric car and the production of batteries and using batteries, that would use a similar supply chain to tech, so phones. Not saying it's right from a social or labor perspective, but they were thinking way ahead in how they were, approaching the battery and how the supply chain can be built up at scale, working across like the system and beyond the electric car system into general tech. And just his model, I think, could be used to some extent within the food system. And how can we inflict change at scale?
Well, I think that, the thing that I think about that is, to me, it feels like the food system was, over the last 50 years, the food system that was created was built on this sort of like this fundamental equation, which was, sort of what I discussed in the beginning. But if you can, the best business for food is to mass produce shelf stable products and send them everywhere. And and you see that this idea that, processed shelf stable food is the sort of dominant, food made by these big food companies. And, you know, one of the things that I sort of chuckle about sometimes is going, for example, to the Natural Foods Expo, and you see all these folks deeply focused on healthy food, and they're all coming out with the latest sort of like bar or candy or other sort of shelf stable sort of CPG product. And sort of like the sort of electric car view, like our sort of view is, you got to create, like, what the food system needs is fresh, healthy, you know, perishable food, basically, to sort of summarize it. And so, you know, in order, it's going to be hard to get the established food companies to build a completely new supply chain and completely new structure that is based on something that is sort of outside their wheelhouse. And, you know, I don't know as much about it as Errol does, but that's sort of our view. And so, but I do think that, like, Tesla is an interesting example, you know, to your point, not about their treatment of workers, but about sort of disrupting an industry. And, you know, one of the things that we look at, actually, and this sort of goes back to Mike's question, is there's this company in China called Pinduoduo that's the first, you know, within 5 years grew to $100 billion in sales, like the craziest sort of thing ever. And one of the ways they did it, they started actually with fruit. And what they did, and then they've sort of expanded past it, but they do this basically like social e-commerce. And basically how they work it is that, you know, if you're going to buy something and it's $5, but they'll say, if you get 4 friends to buy it, we'll drop the price to $3. And so, you know, if you can imagine from a business perspective, it was like the greatest sort of customer acquisition tool ever, but it really was allowing people to sort of like socialize their purchasing behavior to drive sort of economies of scale and volume discounts. And, you know, we sort of look at that and wonder, like, is there a way that you could do that with sort of fresh, healthy food, to sort of get people sort of pushing each other to sort of order the same thing?
Just a couple of quick notes on tech. You know, I think we all love, you know, the innovations and just the amount of life changes that technology has brought. But, you know, all these cute gizmos have also come at staggering inequality in the supply chain. And every time there is a new tech idea, tech concept, you know, particularly in the delivery fulfillment ecosystem, it's extractive from other layers. It's you know, whether you're looking at the DoorDash, Deliveroo angle of, you know, charging exorbitant fees for restaurants and, you know, wage theft lawsuits with delivery workers, or you're looking at the, you know, the transport sector that really drove the Prop 22, you know, for folks that want flexible, you know, lifestyles and work. However, you know, they're excluded from basic labor protections as well. So tech as an extractive model, as this predatory model that benefits the shareholder class, needs to change. And if you look online, and I referenced this too, platform co-ops and tech co-ops, it's a small growing trend. And maybe those folks who are in the finance sector need to think about ways, alternate finance structures to grow these non-extractive, non-predatory tech models, because God damn it, we all love all these changes. These things are great. I love solar power. I love electric cars, you know, but not at the expense of the folks making it or delivering, right?
Errol,
Yeah.
that's such an important point. I mean, I think, you know, it's something that I say, obviously I'm in this food tech world and in these conversations, and so often there is no conversation around the ethics of the technologies that are being created, right? And they shape our lives, they shape the way that we work, and that's definitely a topic that, I mean, we could have a whole session on that, and we will. It's something that we want to keep on having conversations around, because I think it is really important, and there are some really interesting technologies that are being designed, especially in the ag tech space right now, that are cooperative owned, right? Which is and founded by farmers for farmers. So thanks for bringing that up.
If we could just give one example of how this all filters down in real life, right? So Gerardo and I both did melons for years and years, right? Watermelon harvesting. We were there when the first seedless melon, which is a new form of technology, right? But the first seedless melons started to appear in the market or in the fields. Very beginning of that whole thing. So much so that then when we were packing one year in Central Florida, it was the first seedless field we'd ever been in. And the broker we worked with, who was between us and the farmer, said, okay, this thing's gonna be, we have to put stickers on this. You know, we never stickered melons before that. And we have to put them in the bins. So we had to like make bins and put them on pallets and have them forklift. And we had to do all this extra work in order for us to take the seedless melons from the field to the market. And he said, so don't worry about it. I'll get some people from town to do the stickering, and I'll get my other guy here to run the forklift. We'll be good. All right. We're like, all right, fine. So we did that for a season. The next season, suddenly our 12 people in our crew had to absorb the stickering job, the forklift job, the pallet and bin making job. And so suddenly our slice of the pie, he didn't increase the amount, the penny and a half or 2 pennies per pound that we got to divide among ourselves. We still got the same amount of money for the work we did. We just got more work put down on us from above. The market demanded these small melons that fit into refrigerators. The buyers demanded the farmers plant them, and the farmers demanded the brokers that they get produced and they get packed in the way they need to be packed. And the brokers demanded to the workers that you figure out a way with the money I already pay you to do more work, right? So that's how that filters down in the actual food market to the actual field. And we live that process. The reason that's possible is power. From every single part of the thing. Consumers like smaller things that fit in the refrigerators. So they tell their grocers they want to have these new small melons that are seedless. The grocers have the power to tell the growers what they want them to grow. So they start planting these bizarre plants that don't require, that you have to have pollinating plants running row by row between them in order to actually pollinate them. And then that gets passed down to the worker. And yet the worker is the one, because they're the least powerful in the totem pole, who absorbs the cost and whose life gets diminished as a result. And I think you can take that and kind of look at it writ large across all these changes that are happening in terms of technology. Unless we address the power imbalances, we can't equitably divide the new requirements of any innovation that comes down the market.
And if I can echo some of the things that Greg said, it is a matter of power that doesn't get solved with technology. It gets solved with willingness to be able to guarantee that workers are protected if they are part of your supply chain. And that doesn't change necessarily with new ideas in technology. Of course, if there's innovation and it works, it makes sense, and we're all for it. But what I want to say is another aspect that is necessary for anyone who's trying to do it right. It's to understand the context in which we are talking about these things happen. And for that, I just want to mention as a research, we came across some people from Harvard many, many years ago. And they started to study, how effective the different systems, different ideas of social responsibility were being implemented. 10 years later, they came out with a result of that research that incorporated, I think, 40 different initiatives, MSI, initiatives and models that are part of the conversation, the ongoing conversation around social justice. And when they talk about pretty much across the board, what they were saying the right things, but that doesn't matter. At the end, there were no clear, concrete results. The measuring of the results was completely off because it didn't include workers, because it didn't include legally binding agreements. Now, technology, yes, all for it if it's something that doesn't result in the change that Greg was mentioning, right? In that case, consideration should have been made in terms of how this is going to impact thousands and thousands of workers at the same time. From one day to the next, our earnings just like were cut dramatically. Nobody said anything, but we carry millions of pounds of watermelons every month, millions. So at the end of the season, we are moving a lot of watermelons that end up in everyone's table. Everybody's happy except us. That's what I'm talking about. If it's any innovation, I don't care what it is. It can be technology, it can be new systems. If they are better than what we have, we're all for it. But what we want is assurances that our dignity and our pay and the things that we have been working to gain are not crucified in the process. business don't have to do that. So I'm going to encourage you to look at the MSI integrity research that was done with this group based on Harvard. And the name of the research is Not Fit for Purpose. And learn more about this. Learn why what we are talking about is not just us saying it. It has data to back it up. We have everything to prove that what we are talking about in terms of the changes in the fields are true. Technology should serve to amplify that, not to limit it.
Great, thank you all. Next, we have Victoria, who has a question about offsetting costs for farmers who we're going to bring up. But I also want to flag something that someone anonymously asked, but it's one of the most highly voted questions, which I think can be part of this, around if you're not a Whole Foods or a McDonald's, but rather a small distributor or a single unit store or a young CPG company where every dollar counts, how are you impacting change, right? And we see that a lot of those kinds of companies are more interested in sourcing organically. So, I think that that's a key part of how we help farmers get organic certification or some of these other certifications that some of these smaller retailers, distributors, CPG companies are looking for their products. So Victoria, you want to come up to ask your question?
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, so a few years back, I was at the farmers market testing out a model for a healthier fast food concept. And I built a lot of relationships with farmers who were local to my area. And one of the biggest things for me was that I wanted to be an all organic company, but I couldn't work with the smaller farmers who had practiced organic farming systems and everything, but they couldn't afford the certification. So my question kind of goes back to what we discussed earlier with, I believe either Errol or Greg mentioned like the power of purchasing order and how they implemented systems and certification to meet in order to be a vendor for a big supplier or something. So I guess my question is, as we implement more programs for farmers to certify for, do we have programs that offset the costs for getting that certification itself?
I can tell you that the Fair Food Program was born in the fields, right? It wasn't born in the boardrooms. So it was born to address the problems in the fields. And one of the things, we first learned through trial and error was of trying to bring growers to the table to have a voice and the decisions that shaped farmers' lives, was that there is a price squeeze. There's a cost price squeeze for growers that makes the kinds of changes that we were hoping to see very difficult, if not impossible, right? And that kind of goes to exactly what you're saying. Even if you really want to do a certification, organic or human rights certification, and you don't have the margin, then you're not going to do it, and you're going to miss out on that market. And even if the buyers are asking you to do so, what we did as a result was we built part of the cost into the program. And that's why it's somewhat hard to actually expand this program, and why Wendy's, for example, isn't joining, right? Whereas the rest of fast food has already joined, because it's not just, Errol was talking about fair trade and how little it's actually sort of achieved and how widely it's spread. Why does it spread widely? Because it doesn't cost the buyer anything, right? As long as they can sell whatever they buy at fair trade, they're not putting any additional cost out to do it, because they're selling it at that higher cost. What we say to the buyers is, you need to pay a penny more per pound, or more depending on the variety, but a penny more per pound for tomatoes you buy through this program, so that money can go directly to the workers to help improve their wages, right? So that cost of complying with the program is borne by the buyer, right? Not by the grower. And then we don't charge, the Fair Food Standards Council, which is the monitoring organization in the Fair Food Program, doesn't charge growers for certification or for audits or for anything. In fact, the Fair Food Standards Council provides free human relations support and consultation in order to help growers come into compliance with the program. So the whole thing was built around exactly the question you're asking, because it came from the bottom, because it wasn't a program created to solve a problem of public relations for the corporations at the top. It was a program created to solve a problem of human rights for workers at the bottom. And since we understood that those human rights were to a certain degree sort of the parameters of them and how much they could expand were set by the price coming down, we decided to make the buyers part of the solution through the premium, and to not charge the growers any additional money for the certification. So it can be done. It has been done. And the buyers, once again, should play a role in making certification possible if they're going to be demanding certification. It's the same question that we just discussed with seedless melons. If you're going to demand that growers make seedless melons and there's additional cost involved, don't just sit there and pass that cost all the way down knowing that someone's going to pay it, right? Because you as a buyer demand it to be in pallets and in boxes and stickered, right? If you know that's how you're going to demand this new kind of melon, then do something to help make it possible so you don't impoverish people at the bottom when you make that decision.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. There are so many great questions, and we're gonna, we'll have more time in the breakouts, and then we're gonna continue this on Slack. But want to call up Claire for this last question.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Claire Cornetta. I work for Participant Media. And Sam, I was thrilled to hear that you loved A Place at the Table. That's one of our films. So my question is about race issues in regenerative agriculture, and a quote that I've been thinking about recently, which was in a great article. Romero Briones with the First Nations Development Institute said that the present day regenerative movement is much like agriculture in general, inherited, guarded, and perpetuated by white men. So, it's no secret that the movement towards regenerative agriculture has a significant race problem, especially in unacknowledged use of ancestral farming practices. And I'm curious to the panel, what is retail's role in combating these issues?
I think that retailers should be looking at their supply chains and asking why the majority of their suppliers are owned by white people and owned by people with resources and that are able to start brands. And I don't think any one of us is going to solve that on our own, because, in order to start a food company, there was just an article that came out the other day. I'm not sure if it was in the Washington Post or the Guardian. It's like the thing that each successful entrepreneur had that helped them get started was, I don't know, like a trust fund or rich parents or something. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess that's why I became a stock clerk, right? And it's the same thing, with, race dynamics too in the food industry. For, the 170 years since Reconstruction, Black people were getting driven off the land and dispossessed. Native Americans were getting dispossessed. There was a termination program back in the 30s and 40s. All the while, you've got a USDA that essentially subsidized land speculation by white farmers, that underwrites commodity conventional crops, and also created the access for cheap land back in the 50s and 60s, which enabled the back to the land movement for a lot of hippies and organic farmers to get started, primarily white, right? So we have an institutional and historical issue. So once again, looking at your supply chains, what can you do? And this is something that I work with a couple of the companies I work on day to day, is that there may not be that many right now, but start working with the ones that are out there. Start working with Native American, Indigenous American suppliers, not calling it like primitive or other some sort of derogatory word for their traditional worldviews and their tech. It's their food tech. And making sure that if they're selling to you, that they are then profiting, and that they are benefiting from these types of foods and, this technology that they have for what is being called regenerative or holistic management, or all these other ways that, entrepreneurs were mostly white. I mean, guys, Alan Savory worked for the Rhodesian government hunting Black people as a scout, as a ranger. That's gross, right? Maybe he's apologized, but let's acknowledge that we have a white supremacy issue in holistic management. Let's acknowledge that in regenerative ag is just a takeoff of all of ag. And look, it's the same thing in organic, guys. There's no labor protections for organic, farm workers. There's a very, very strong racial dynamic in the natural products trade and organic food trade, leaning towards primarily white suppliers. These are institutional, historical issues. Start working with the folks that are out there, encouraging them. Are you recruiting folks from historically Black colleges and universities into the food business? Are you working on policy levers to increase access to land, to make sure that folks who want to grow food, that want to start food businesses? Are you working with this huge movement of like co-ops, primarily worker-owned, employee-owned businesses that are very much being driven by people of color because they've been excluded from traditional finance and traditional CPG? So it's out there, but I also want to say that I think it should take more of a concerted effort from the industry. And I think that we as an industry should make a commitment and start looking at creating goals and strategies around making sure that our food system actually looks like our society, and that the ownership, the wealth, the governance, the income distribution is fair and equitable and not reifying and reinforcing white supremacy.
I agree with that, and I think that like the way sort of we look at that question is the same way we look at the franchise, which is insist on diversity, and at the same time a lot of the root of income inequality and the racial wealth gap has to do with sort of access to capital. So can we create a system? And for us, it looks like partnering with large foundations to get a pool of capital, folks like California Farm Link, basically like an advantageous lending structure to help better capitalize farmers of color who want to grow and practice, for example, regenerative agriculture.
Is there anyone else who wanted to add anything before we close out the discussion?
I would like to say something in regards to the Fair Food Program. In our community is made up of workers mainly from Mexico, Guatemala, Haiti, a few workers from Central America. Sometimes, and I don't know why, those understandings around racism and what we are doing to fight against it don't necessarily incorporate in the open conversations in the country. The changes that are actually taking place is almost as if it's more important to have the conversation, and I think it's both. I think obviously the conversation needs to happen, but also the understanding on what is actually working in the realities of the work. For people of color. In our case, there has been a lot of division in the fields. When you as a worker prior to the Fair Food Program would go to the fields, you would be divided by country. You would be told like, are you gonna let this person from Haiti, and they would use racial slurs, be faster than you, picking faster than you? They would go to people from Mexico, do the same in regards to the people from Guatemala, and it was all a cycle of that. People were constantly injected with those mentalities. What the program did, it's basically that flipped over and stopped that kind of behavior from the part of supervisors, food leaders, and then established an understanding for workers in the fields that this is something that cannot continue happening, even though your own bosses were the ones promoting that kind of behavior. So there is a system in place. But more than anything, I want to highlight something that in the first years of the fight for fair food, to bring corporations to be part of the Fair Food Program, many of the workers from the Haitian community that had family connections in town would leave work to look for something else because anything was better. But once we landed the Fair Food Program, a lot of food from the Haitian community that had other opportunities that were better because they had the support of the family versus people that for the most part come along from Mexico and Guatemala, a few families. So that setting allowed for that. Workers are coming back to work in the fields because conditions have improved, because there is respect, because there are provisions that prohibit discrimination, prohibit violence, prohibit situations of modern day slavery taking place. And that's how we do something in regards to racism. It cannot be just a conversation to be politically correct. It needs to include actions to drive the realities where this abusive behavior is taking place to a place in which we can get rid of it. And that's what I would say. I think that, again, what we have is having an impact right now in 8 states. And all of these can be and should be expanded so that these provisions can also take place in other areas in the country. But we cannot do that alone. So again, I leave that in the table. If there's anyone who wants to, get involved in something like this, just hit us up. Just let us know, because that's what's required, and that's how we can have real conversations about racism that include, the conditions that make people have to basically endure in the places of work this kind of abuse.
Thank you so much. And we're going to send out more information to everyone about how you can get involved with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And just want to thank all of you, all of our panelists, for your amazing, the amazing discussion today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Again, our apologies that there were some issues with one of the links that went out. Mercury is in retrograde, and so we got that all fixed for future conversations. And just want to let everyone know that we'll be sending out a video from this discussion, so you will not have missed anything. We are now going to break people up into breakout groups. We know that not everyone enjoys breakout groups or feels comfortable in them. So if you don't want to join, you can just simply end this your Zoom, and this is official end to the program. We also know that there are some of you that may have wanted to continue, but we went a little bit over. So understand if you're not able to join there. If you do join a breakout room, then we encourage you to start by introducing yourself, and then, having some conversation around one of the things that you've learned or you're curious to continue talking about from this discussion. We are also going to keep the conversation going in Slack. There were so many great questions that we couldn't get into, and I know there's a lot more depth that we can go into on the questions that we've started discussing. So, again, we've tried to create this as a community. We want this to not just be one-off conversations, but really to be the start of ongoing collaboration and really fundamentally redesigning this food system to make it more equitable, delicious, just, all of the above. So thank you so much to everyone, and look forward to connecting with you all for the final session and in Slack. Thanks so much.